In our particular infographic, we're going to be looking at kind of vertical composition, and we're going to have 4 or 5 pieces of information. So it's kind of a common thing where you're going to be trying to get kind of use space as a way to organize information, so that way it's easy for the viewer to understand kind of what's most important, what's next most important, and to use space as a visual way of imparting understanding, as well as making something be visually appealing. So we've talked about things like balance and contrast and scale as a way of making things be visually appealing, but there are also ways that we can kind of utilize in order to make the viewer more quickly understand our message. And there's kind of a long history of this. So I wanted to go a little bit over kind of what we're drawing on when we're drawing on space, and kind of the theories and the thought process that people had about space. So oftentimes we'll see these images and not really kind of have the context. So a little bit of a history of the grid with the avant-garde. And so to many people, thinking of a grid, you don't really think of things that are avant-garde and cutting edge. But by exposing the conceit of a grid within printed works, it was actually quite revolutionary at the time. This quote is from Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton, and also remembering that for most of the time that we were creating visual graphics, we were talking about making printed graphics. It wasn't on screen. And so a lot of our screen ideas are kind of based in the history and the language of printed material. Now, when you even had an illustration back before the 1960s, you would have a physical block that the image was, say, etched onto, or it was, depending if it was like a wood carving, whatnot. But it would have to be produced in a square format so that it could be fit into a letterpress, and that ink could be rolled over it, and then the paper could be pressed on top of it. Even kind of there are different methods of doing this printing, but they all kind of revolved around the idea that you would be kind of working within some kind of grid format. And so if you had something that broke the grid, you actually had to like kind of basically draw that out in, say, if it's on an angle, however you did it, and physically manipulate it. Because when you're using this movable type, when you're using imagery within a letterpress, you really can't break out of the grid. So it kind of informed everything that was mechanically reproduced. If you were a fine artist and you were creating a one-off painting, well, that's great. But for anything that's reproducible, anything that's given out to the masses, you're kind of stuck in this grid. So it kind of set up this way of thinking about imagery as being kind of protected by the frame of the page, or protected by the frame of, again, it's a kind of iteration of artwork, which is protected by a literal frame. But what people tried to do at the kind of, usually kind of, we're talking about like the 1900s and turning into, get the 20th century, things are kind of becoming more industrial, is make really apparent that we are stuck in this kind of grid. We are making the structure really like it's part of the work rather than trying to hide it. So they're looking at that barrier between high art and low art. It's the same thing that kind of comes up, it's very cyclical, comes up again. It's the things that you see around, it's like street art and fashion, and you see around things like comics and graphic novels. So you have this kind of constant churn between what's considered for the populace, for the masses, and what's considered high art. So we have these people who are wanting to break down those barriers and to kind of say that this is all kind of democratizing things. And so they actually use this kind of grid format as a way to break down those barriers. So what to us seems, in the same way that like when you look at an impressionist painting, we consider that quite tame and normal and everyday, but at the time it caused outrage. The same thing is true of using kind of a grid in design. So when we start at the beginning of the 20th century and you have futurism, you have people like Martinetti, who was interested in the kind of very sensorial or sensual feeling of the city. So the noise of the cars, the sound of planes, the kind of screech of trolleys through the streets, these kind of sounds of urban landscape, he wanted to make kind of very visceral in his work. And futurism is very much, again, towards the future, kind of thinking about this chrome industrial kind of utopian ideal of what the future would bring. And so he's utilizing things like poetry and like how he's printing as a way of kind of thinking about and making really apparent the industrial structures, either in life, in art, or in this case, in the printed word. So you start getting it's kind of like a concrete poem, and the way that you get concrete poetry is much more popular again in the 60s. But this is kind of one of the first attempts at concrete poems. And again, it's playing with printing and how we're visually seeing the poetry. So here you can kind of see the fact that the largest part of the grid is these CHs, the CH here and the R at the end here. And then each of these things has to take up a certain amount of space within that grid. So you can see this R with the space around it. That's partly because that's how big that R is in the physical lead type. And then he's slotting these other pieces next to it. And he's actually having to use spacers to keep these from falling down into this space. So he's kind of using that grid structure while he's fighting against it. And then you get the Dadaists, and they're kind of coming up another like 10, 15 years after that. And again, we're all having to work within this kind of letterpress, and we're starting to get into being able to use photography because that's becoming more common. But even at that, when you're printing it, you're having to still put it back into some kind of grid structure. We don't have kind of like the rolling presses for a little bit longer. So again, you can see that there is a grid structure that's involved in order to make it work, but they're playing with how they place things. They're playing with scale. They're playing with kind of the movement of the eye across the page as a way of saying, okay, yeah, we're constrained by this, but we're going to try to break through it. And so the Dada artists are very much grounded in like World War II. So we've got this kind of what everyone feels like is this huge breakdown of kind of the norms of society. People feel like, oh my God, the world is ending. And so there's this anxiety. And so again, part of what they're trying to do is express that through this kind of chaos on the page. I should also note futurism is kind of very much rooted. So earlier, this is kind of pre-World War I. Futurism and the Futurist Manifesto is very much rooted in kind of Italy and the beginnings of fascism. And so then you have things like Dadaism, which, while drawing on visuals from folk like Martinetti, is very much kind of the flip side of the coin. And again, when we're trying to show chaos through kind of utilizing geometric form in this way, you get into Russia around, again, the same time that you kind of get in the tail end of Dada, and you're getting the beginning of constructivism, which is very much grounded in the Russian Revolution. And so, again, it's very geometric and very angular, but again, it's trying to use this as a way of, they're trying to create like a universal language, because the fact that these are all very kind of common building blocks, and using that as a way to create meaning. And so in this case, you've got this red wedge, which is of course the red Bolsheviks, breaking through into kind of the white, which is kind of like the old Tsarist regime, and shattering the status quo. So in this case, again, we're still using the mechanics of physical printing and the fact that you're having to fit everything on these grids, but he's kind of activating it in a way that brings energy to the page and to the space. And constructivism is very rules-based. And again, it's very much based on circle, square, triangle. and very kind of basic geometric forms. But even though you're using really basic forms, you get really dynamic results. And I think that's something that's really important to remember, is that at times these constraints, or these kind of concepts behind it, you might think it makes things very boring, or everything looks the same, or it's very sterile. But in fact, you can use it in creative ways to create things that are full of energy and dynamism. And then as time goes on, we get into kind of the next stage, where we get Dutch artists and designers who again are trying to create some kind of universal language through using a grid. Because again, we're using very common pieces that kind of transcend any individual language. So you have people who are using kind of horizontals and verticals in order to convey meaning. Again, kind of what we talked about at the very beginning, where like different kinds of lines have different kinds of energy, and we kind of give different like ideas to them. So when you have horizontals and verticals intersecting, we feel this kind of very structural, very physically sound. Whereas, you know, when you see these kind of angles, it's more dynamic, but it's also a feeling of, you know, the kind of energy and destruction comes with it. So when you have artists, and then in this case we have designers who are kind of working with artists, they're using the grid in a way not to bound space, but to kind of almost transcend the limit of the space that they're in, and trying to imply speed and motion and a feeling of energy beyond the edges of the page. While you may not know the names of the people who are kind of key members in De Stijl, you've probably seen a Mondrian painting. And I mean, to me, one of the things I find really interesting about something like this is that a lot of his work is based around jazz music, and is based around the energy of the city, and the idea that you would boil down the energy of that kind of vibrancy to these kind of basic building blocks. And again, he only uses black, white, red, yellow, and blue, kind of the basic colors. And he started off kind of using diagonals, but then he's like, nope, in my kind of visual language, I'm only using horizontals and verticals. And so the idea that you can capture energy that way. And I also wanted to mention that, you know, why are we talking about history when we're talking about making stuff now? None of these things kind of stop influencing us as we go forward. So the band The White Stripes, one of their, the second album, is De Stijl. And so, you know, this stuff doesn't stop influencing artists and designers as we go forward in time, just because it was based in the context of whatever time period it came up in. So around the same time that we've got De Stijl over in kind of the Netherlands, and then you also get people who are up in the Nordic countries doing some similar things. In Germany, you've got Bauhaus, and I don't mean the metal band, or the goth band, whatever genre you think that Bauhaus falls into. And again, Bauhaus was very rules-based, and it was trying to create this kind of future where we would have this universal language of design and of art. And by kind of creating these formal structures, and by using formal structures as a way of forming these universals. And so this is the letterhead that was designed for Bauhaus. And so, you know, as we're kind of getting out of the World War times, we're kind of getting into kind of more stable times. Again, we've got people who are taking all these ideas and then applying them out of art and into commercial print. So while this was written at the end of the 1920s, we actually see it used in the 1940s. But you have people theorizing about how to take this and apply it in commercial situations, and the fact that this isn't just some crazy high art ideal, this isn't some art school thing like the Bauhaus, but that this is something that we can use in order to create better work and to make better things that are commercially mass produced, because part of this is about the fact that the things that we use every day should be good. The things that we use should create visual joy, and that it shouldn't just be the elites who get to have nice things, but everyone should be able to share that. So magazines should be produced in a visually appealing way. Pamphlets, books, textbooks, they should all make sure that they kind of reach their communication goal, not just through the text and the images, but in how it's laid out. So we kind of start getting into kind of the idea of having designers being a profession. So we start advocating using design as a way of ordering things in order to create meaning. And this kind of holds true for quite some time. So we get into modernism and we start thinking about the ideas. Again, this is kind of building on the ideas of universals. Modernism is very much rooted in universalism. And so this is how it presents itself in architecture. Probably when most people hear modernism, we think about large expanses of glass. But the way that it made itself kind of known through design is through what's usually called either the Swiss style or the international style. And it's used quite extensively for a while through modernism. Then we get into postmodernism, falls out of style, but as you'll see, it kind of comes back as we get into the web, because we want to make sure things are accessible. And part of accessibility in universal design is utilizing things like structures like grids in order to make sure that everyone can access information. So as I said about the fact that in 1928, you've got people kind of theorizing. In 1940, we actually have people putting the stuff into practice, where you're using kind of grids in order to convey meaning. And this international style becomes very popular for quite some time. And the video that we'll watch actually looks at a bunch of international style posters as a way of kind of going over the concepts that we talked about at the beginning of design in terms of different design ideas. So if you guys have, you will a bit later, we'll talk about vector graphics versus raster graphics. Raster is the word for grid. And we're using the grid in order to convey information. And so that's how we start talking about page layout. And it is the thing that we use when we're in Photoshop. So instead of, there is kind of an association with modernism and things being, with the universal idea kind of feeling cold and detached and maybe humanless. They were thinking of it more as a, quote, cool and fascinating beauty. They were thinking of, like, people who were coming up with modernist ideals at the time, were thinking of it as a way of kind of transcending the limits of a specific, sorry, 495 is like right over there from my house, and a big truck just used their air brakes. That's always fun. Transcending the limits of our kind of local purview and creating something that kind of goes beyond that. And so they wanted to use the grid as a way of speaking to kind of like the everyman. At times we can feel like it's almost too programmatic, it's a little bit too structured. And so that's where you start to see at the beginning people adhere to it very strictly, and then we use it as a way to activate the space and kind of create more dynamic ideas. But we can see that while this is stuff that was coming out in the 30s, it's still being used in times like 1964. And in fact, you can get a copy of this. Carl Gerstner's, I think, son, basically runs the site that has designing programs, and you can get a free copy of it on the web. I can get a download of it if you are interested. And so it's all about using systems in order to lay out your material to make it easy for the eye to take in the ideas and to get to the solution as quickly as possible. And so he's using this grid as a program as a set of rules, as a kind of methodology to get to your visual solution. And so these kind of things, it can seem like a way that you can take the same idea and kind of break it down in multiple ways in order to make it easier for us to understand. So the Swiss style, kind of everything ends up fitting into kind of boxes or modules, and it's very modular. You can switch out one bit for another bit and kind of move things around. The nice thing about it when you're using it for layout is that if you've got your space subdivided, it doesn't have to look like everything fits in exactly one unit. You can play with how things span different columns and squares in order to make a visual that looks dynamic, but you know everything is always going to fit together in the end. And everything refers back to the original structure, so you know it all flows and it's all going to work together. You're not going to get to the end and suddenly you don't know what to do with all the stuff. So it can be a way of helping you as a designer know that you're going to be able to make everything work, but you also know that you can utilize different parts of it and have things still look dynamic and interesting. So this became known as Swiss design, even though it wasn't solely done in Switzerland, but that's where it was popularized from. Again, if you're thinking in terms of text and fonts, Helvetica very much comes out of this style. So Helvetica is a sans serif, and it's geometric, and it's also humanist. It has human qualities to it. It has parts of it that harken back to how we would write by hand. And I think that kind of sums up a lot of the kind of both sides of the Swiss rationalism. It is very rationalist based in that kind of geometry, but there's still a hint of the humanity in it, that there's still that understanding that this is created by people, not computers, and that it's rational, but it's not cold. Although oftentimes it kind of gets well, I suppose in how it's done, it can be done in a cold manner, but I think it kind of gets categorized as a whole as being, cold, but I think that that's perhaps an unfair assessment. And as we got into postmodernism, and as a whole, I am pro postmodernism. I think, the fact that we are individuals is really important. But I also am very much for accessible design. And so when we got into kind of postmodern design, it was very chaotic. And it wasn't chaotic like the constructivist was chaotic. It was full on, like, overlaying each other chaotic. There was no separation between any element. And that can be a problem, especially if you are designing on the web. If you have lots of information, this can be really problematic. So as we started to have information be key in our design, again, we kind of came back to the Swiss rationalism because it was a way of making sense of large amounts of information. So now that we're concerned with universal design, making sure that things are accessible to people, but also just the amount of information we have. When we were talking about information data being the new soil, we have so much information we need to sort through. How do you make it make sense to people? So we went from this is a Russian avant-garde poster. So we had this concept of the grid and being able to use it as something that is dynamic and that has a life to its own and that has energy to it rather than being something that's cold and dead and done by a computer. So there's an idea that when we're online too, you have this grid, everything's computer based, but we're not bounded by the page anymore. We can go out in infinite directions because it's all data. Infinite Canvas was an idea from the comic creator Scott McCloud about making a comic that would not be bound by the confines of a page, but because it was online, it can go out in any direction and go on infinitely. So we're thinking about the grid as infinite space, the fact that it is not bound by being physical, analog, our human body, but that it is something that can transcend us. So while 20th century avant-garde designers, they kind of exploded the grid, they exposed the grid in order to draw attention to it, we're kind of doing something similar with how we're looking at design now. So we had this idea of a universal language coming from the Swiss, and we've kind of come back to it through design now. So we've got this kind of second modernism that's coming out. So the internet's not going to be utopia. I mean, I'm pretty sure we all know that, but it does allow us to break down some barriers. And so this is a visualization of Scott McCloud's idea of the infinite canvas as a comic, but again, thinking about the breakdown of barriers as a way to open up information to more people. And so this is an example of a website from the Sandberg Institute where it physically reacts to the user's mouse as they move across the screen. It's just kind of an experimental idea from a little while ago, but these screen grabs kind of demonstrate how you can utilize a grid and still have it be responsive and human. So we're thinking about ways in which we can use this kind of structure to impart ideas, but that again, it doesn't have to be kind of boring and rigid, but that we can use it as a way of ordering our ideas and information, but still having it be active. And the internet has rekindled this idea of universal design thinking. And whereas people thought when we got into postmodernism that modernism was over, in fact, it's kind of been a rebirth of it. And so this image here, one thing I wanted to show you is that most websites do utilize a grid structure. So in the same way that when we're looking at our infographic, you're probably going to be, using information. They're going to be divided into different fields. Each of your steps, each of your pieces of information might have be kind of divided from each other in some way. Similarly, when you look at how things are online, you don't see all the grids and all the subdivisions, but everything kind of fits into it in some way. I think is kind of a useful way of looking at it. And I like this quote. I just realized that the comma should go with his name, but that's all right. But to produce designs that are objectively informative is primarily a socio-cultural task. So the idea that when we're creating information design, when we're doing communication design, when we're trying to give people information, it's not like in isolation, that it's part of creating media and culture, that it's part of communication. And communication is not something that's done in isolation, but it's about two people or two groups of people having a conversation. And so it's rooted in kind of our humanness and in how we exchange ideas.